So today I'm just going to start by giving you a little bit more detail, build on the first part of my presentation yesterday, where I go through a little bit more of the details behind the state and transition simulation model approach. I'm going to talk a little bit about the software conceptually with some slides. And that I'm hoping will take us maybe 20, 25 minutes, take a little break for some questions, and then I'm going to fire up the software and we're going to look live at a case study model we've done for that we've been working on, and I've been involved with some people already in Australia. I don't know how many of them on the line. Anna certainly has been involved with this, but we'll talk about that more in a minute. So this is, again, I said the repeat part. This is what I talked about yesterday. Just the basic math behind the state and transition simulation model approach is very, very simple. You have a landscape, you divide it into spatial cells, and you come up with a lexicon for your states that you wish to represent in your landscape. And you have to assign each cell to one of those discrete states. And I show a very simple model here with 3 possible states. And you can optionally add a counter to that. We call the counter age, AGE, but the age ends up meaning whatever you define it to through the rest of the model. In fact, the model actually, software tracks time since any transition, and you can label one of those to be age. Usually we think of it as a stand replacing transition in a forest context, but it can be anything you want, but it's a counter. And then we developed this thing called a pathway, we call a pathway diagram, box and arrow diagram, that describes the transitions that are possible between states. And we typically assign probabilities to those transitions, although as you'll see, there are alternate ways to express the rate of each transition. But if we express them as probabilities, we can treat the state and age as stochastic random variables, and we can simulate their fate out in time based on the diagram and the probabilities, and we can estimate then sometime out in the future the state and age of each cell, and we can repeat that for all our cells, spatial cells. We end up with projections of future state and age across the entire landscape. And because there's probabilities involved in here, there's stochasticity, every time we do that process, we're going to get a slightly different result for the projections for each spatial cell. And so this allows us a lever to capture uncertainty and variability in our projections in our landscape. So just a little bit now, so add some stuff to yesterday's presentation. So I've already suggested that the transitions can be expressed in their most basic form as probabilities. Those probability, the rate per time step. Time steps are typically in landscape simulations a year, but they don't have to be. But because we're tracking age as a state variable, we can make those probabilities conditional on the age of each cell as well. It's something that's a little different from, say, a Markov chain. We can also choose to express some of the transitions as targets rather than probabilities. And this is typically used for anthropogenic, management-oriented transitions. And again, just to point out the differences between sort of this and what you might think of as a classic Markov chain is we can have multiple pathways between pairs of states. Okay. Now, just to make it clear that, first of all, we can have temporal variability in the rates, the targets, and the probabilities that we put in our model. So that's important. We don't have to have them fixed for the entire simulation. The approach allows you to vary them over time. And it also allows you to express those rates, whether they be probabilities or gain targets, as distributions, if you like. They don't have to be fixed values even over time. So that's the temporal variability. Similarly, you can add spatial variability to these models. So this is an example here where you might have a transition that you believe has some spatial autocorrelation in it. You want to express that autocorrelation in your model. The classic example is fire, which comes down in spatial clumps. And so the framework, again, the STSM framework, allows you to express spatial variability in your probabilities for your transitions however you like. And so in this example, you might have some external fire model, however you develop it. It could actually be written in our code. It could be factored into our software directly. But if you have some model for how you think the probabilities vary spatially as well as temporally, you can bring that into the model, and you can use that to influence those probabilities over space and time. And the result is you can end up with spatial patterns on your landscape as well. So those are the basics of the technique. A few things you can do with the STSim software that's used a lot. The first is that you can take a landscape. I showed one that was, all the cells weren't differentiated one from the others and spatially, but you can stratify your landscape however you like. So this is a feature we use a lot. And the advantage of doing this is we can identify spatial strata in our landscape, and then we can develop alternative parameterizations, in fact, alternative pathway diagrams, complete alternative models for each one of those strata. So it's a way to vary the model structure and parameters spatially rather than having to think about it on a cell-by-cell basis. And in STSim, we have 3 levels of strata that can interact: primary, secondary, and tertiary, we call them. So for example, the primary strata, it's usually a biophysical stratification of your landscape, whereby something like this, I showed this yesterday, you might have some ecoregions in your across your landscape. So maybe they're often sort of soil, moisture, edaphic conditions that vary, where you know that the probabilities and the parameterization of your model varies consistently according to this stratification. And the secondary strata is often used to represent different management regimes on your landscape. So again, you can bring in alternative parameterizations for some of those transitions that you think might be anthropogenic, often the targets. For example, we might have harvest targets by different blocks, or I think in this case, we probably had different, this was for the land carbon model, we had different land use development levels by state, or population growth by state. So we could bring that into our model and use the stratification for that. So that's one feature. The other thing I just want to talk about is the output that comes out of when you're using STSim to develop these models. There's really only, well, I guess there's 3 really types of output, because age and time since transition are one and the same. But for every cell, for every Monte Carlo iteration, and for every time step that you run, you can get output of the state of that cell, its state class. You can get output of the counters, whatever counters you set up. As I said, age is one possible counter. You can also count the time since every transition that's known in your model. And then the final one is you have this binary output, which says for each cell whether it incurred a transition or not in that time step. So that's really all the output there is. You can, in the software, you can obviously, if you run a state and transition simulation model, like I showed yesterday with the land carbon project, we take that output, something like this, and then we interpret it with respect to carbon, right? And so you can easily post-process. And again, you'll see in a minute that STSim allows you to some levers to chain together models and post-process the stuff coming out of one of these landscape change models. So that's always possible. You can also directly in STSim develop some simple metrics. These are often indicators that you want to track in your model, and it's just a little easier to do them directly in the STSim software rather than post-process. But we call those attributes, and there's 2 types that you can manipulate. The first is attributes that are a function of the state of each cell. So for each cell, you can generate formulas that use the state and age and time since transition to compute an indicator. We often use this for simple metrics of, say, habitat is a classic state attribute. And then you can also generate indicators that are a function of the transitions that occurred at each cell. And so these are a function, again, they can be a function of the state and the age and the time since transition, but they are also a function of whether a transition occurred or not of a particular type. And a classic example of a transition attribute might be volume of timber harvested, which is a function of the state, the age, and whether a harvest transition occurred, as an example. Another one is cost. You know, you might have costs of certain treatments that can be easily calculated in the software as a transition attribute. I think the last thing I just wanted to talk about in the modeling is one of the, sort of criticisms in the past from some landscape modelers about state and transition simulation models is they only track discrete states across your landscape. They can't track continuous variables. And in some forests in North America, particularly in eastern North America, they have, these multi canopy forests, and classifying them as one state is not how a lot of ecologists, forest ecologists like to think. They like to think about how much biomass there is in different forest communities on a pixel. So we kind of addressed this fairly recently, and what we've done is we've tried to get over just being able to just track only discrete variables and allow continuous variables to be tracked as well in STSIM. So this goes beyond the state and transition simulation model, but it's something we use, for example, to track biomass. Carbon in particular is where most of the funding came from. So this is an example. You might have a carbon budget model where you're trying to track for every cell in your landscape the continuous quantity of biomass in each one of, say, several carbon pools. This is a classic carbon budget model. So we developed some tools that go along with STSIM now to allow you to do that. So what you're able to do in STSIM is, in the same way you could set up discrete variables, states for each cell in your landscape and track them over time. You can now also add any number of continuous stocks where you want to track that quantity over time. And again, the motivation for this came from a desire, again, it came from the USGS, and they wanted to be able to do integrated carbon budget modeling. And so we developed this feature, but it's generic. It can be used for any kind of stock. And the idea is that you define, similar to having states and transitions, you have stocks and flows. If you're familiar with sort of system dynamics models, stock flow models, software like Stella and Vensim, it's the same principle as that, where you can track a bunch of stocks and move material between them at every time step in your simulation using these flows that you set up. But what's a little different about this from a traditional sort of standalone stock flow model is that you can tie the flow rates in your stock flow model to the transitions in your state and transition model. So, for example, if on a cell in a particular time step, you have a fire that occurs in your simulation for that Monte Carlo realization, you can tell the model that you will trigger a certain number of fluxes in your stock flow model and move carbon around in an integrated way in combination with the transitions that are happening on the landscape change side.